In the year 1894, on the edge of Ashford Hollow, a New England township hemmed by forests and crooked riverbanks, the Whitfield family unveiled their grand estate. At first, it was admired as a monument of wealth and permanence, but soon it earned a far darker name, the Whitfield Mansion Mystery, whispered with the warning that no one ever left alive. Marble columns framed its entrance, French crystal chandeliers scattered light like fractured stars, and windows stretched so high they seemed built to swallow the moonlight whole. Locals gazed in awe at its magnificence, yet in hushed tones confessed their unease. For even in its earliest days, the mansion carried with it an air not only of grandeur, but of dread. The Whitfields were not newcomers to fortune. Their lineage traced back to shipping merchants who had built empires ferrying goods across the Atlantic. By the late 19th century, their wealth had shifted inland. Railroads, textile mills, and landholdings scattered across New England. Patriarch Jonathan Whitfield, a figure of stern composure with a reputation for charitable donations, purchased several hundred acres outside Ashford Hollow and announced that the family would build a palace of permanence to house their descendants for generations to come. To the villagers who lived in drafty farmhouses and timber cottages, the mansion seemed more cathedral than residence. Its construction, carried out by imported craftsmen, was said to drain entire quarries of stone. From the start, the estate drew both awe and unease. The Whitfields insisted on high walls topped with wrought iron, gates that shut with the finality of prison bars, and windows veiled with heavy drapes. Servants were hired from surrounding towns, promised wages far above the norm. Yet within months, the same names ceased to appear on parish rolls and census counts. Some claimed the young girls taken on as maids returned home with hollow eyes, speaking little, before disappearing entirely. Others never returned at all. Neighbors rationalized that the Whitfields, being of higher station, simply sent their servants to other family estates. But a nagging question lingered. If so, why did the mansion staff seem to remain always at the same number, replenished as if from an endless well of the vanished? The public face of the Whitfields contradicted these whispers. At Sunday services, they filled the front pews with quiet reverence. Their charity built the stained glass windows of the local chapel, and their name was etched into plaques at schools and hospitals. Jonathan's wife, Eleanor, was admired for her composure, always seen in black silks that gleamed like oil. Their children, educated abroad, returned each summer for elaborate gatherings on the manicured lawn. These gatherings became town spectacles, orchestras playing under lantern-strung trees, tables of wine and delicacies shipped from Europe, and fireworks that painted the night sky. Invitations were coveted, though those who attended often remarked, sometimes joking, sometimes not, that leaving the gates seemed strangely delayed, as if the mansion itself resisted their exit. As decades passed, the mansion acquired a reputation both gilded and grim. Records show at least 20 workers hired to tend the estate vanished without clear explanation. Parish ledgers contain names crossed through without death dates. Newspaper society pages celebrated Whitfield soirees, yet within weeks there were letters to editors about missing travelers whose last known stop had been the mansion. Still, no accusation stuck. Wealth and influence smothered suspicion. Local officials dined at the Whitfield table, judges enjoyed their brandy, and ministers blessed their children. The mansion's shadow lengthened, but no one dared step fully inside it. Inside accounts were scarce, but those who once worked in the house told unsettling stories. A kitchen maid described being ordered to prepare meals for rooms where no one ever answered the door, trays retrieved later with food untouched. A stable hand swore that he was told never to open the far eastern wing, though he sometimes saw candlelight flicker through its windows. Another spoke of cribs being polished, sheets washed, as if infants lived within though no child was ever seen. Each of these servants left their positions suddenly, many vanishing afterward. What they revealed before their departures hinted not at domestic eccentricities, but at a household arranged around secrets. To the casual visitor, however, the mansion radiated normalcy. Parlors smelled of fresh lilies, libraries groaned with imported tomes, and the dining hall echoed with polite laughter. But beneath this facade, an architecture of unease was taking shape. The iron gates that kept the world out also kept others in. Deliveries of food and coal were tallied far beyond the needs of those visible. Carriages entered the estate more often than they exited. The contrast between the mansion's outward refinement and the whispering void left by those who never emerged created a paradox that the villagers struggled to reconcile. Thus, the legend began, the Whitfield Mansion mystery. Over the years, it came to define not only the estate, but the family itself. Why no one ever left alive was not written in papers, but passed from lip to lip in candlelit kitchens and tavern corners. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the gates. Men on late roads swore they heard voices from the upper windows calling faintly for help. And when the mansion's lights flared at midnight, illuminating the tall trees, villagers muttered prayers, knowing some guest had entered and would not be seen again. By the dawn of the 20th century, the estate stood not as a beacon of wealth, but as a monolith of dread. Its gilded facade still gleamed, its gardens still flourished, but its reputation had curdled. The grandeur of the Whitfields concealed something no public charity or church donation could absolve. The mystery tightened with each vanished life, with each unanswered letter, until the mansion itself seemed less a home than a labyrinth of secrets. And while the family remained untouchable, the unanswered questions spread like ivy across the stone walls. What lay behind the locked corridors of the Whitfield mansion, and why did no one who crossed its threshold ever leave alive? The earliest signs of what became the Whitfield Mansion mystery, why no one ever left alive, did not arrive in the form of scandal or open accusation. They began as small absences, faint gaps in the tapestry of village life. A young maid named Clara Benton was the first. Hired in the spring of 1895, she was seen walking through the iron gates with a carpet bag in one hand and her mother waving from the road. Clara never returned. At first, her family believed she had taken steady work and was simply unable to visit. Letters were written, none answered. A month later, her mother appeared at the mansion, begging for word. The Whitfields politely assured her that Clara had left for Boston to join a cousin. No records in Boston were ever found. Others soon followed. A pair of brothers, Thomas and Henry Miller, were hired to tend the stables in the autumn of that same year. They were known in Ashford Hollow as hard-working lads, fond of card games and quick to laugh. After 2 weeks at the mansion, they vanished. Their wages, according to Whitfield ledgers, were paid in full, yet their family never saw them again. Rumor spread that the brothers had quarreled with their employers and fled west, but no train tickets bore their names, and no letters were ever received. Travelers, too, began to disappear. Ashford Hollow, though small, lay on a road much used by merchants and salesmen. The Whitfields occasionally invited such men to rest a night within their grand estate, a gesture framed as hospitality. One such man, Elias Porter, recorded in his travelogue that he was to stay a night with the Whitfields in their great house on the hill. That entry, dated November of 1896, was the last in his ledger. His employer filed missing reports, but no trace of Elias was ever uncovered. The Whitfields insisted he had departed at dawn. If he had, no one on the road saw him. By the turn of the century, the pattern had grown difficult to ignore. Families whispered of letters unanswered. Parish rolls contained more names struck through without burial records. Some of the missing were drifters, easily dismissed, but others had roots in Ashford Hollow relatives, friends, sons, daughters, and their vanishing left gaps impossible to explain away. Yet when villagers pressed too loudly, they were met with silken reassurances from Jonathan Whitfield himself. With his calm voice and generous hand, he assured families that their loved ones had gone on to seek fortune elsewhere, always promising letters would soon arrive. For a time, people wanted to believe him. Still, doubts spread. Gossip filled taverns and kitchens. Servants whispered of corridors, kept locked, of trays of food left outside doors, never opened in their presence. A laundress claimed she had washed garments far too small for any member of the Whitfield family, dresses for children no one had ever seen. She left her employment abruptly, telling friends she feared something was wrong in those walls. Within a week, she too disappeared, her rented room left with belongings scattered, as if she had been taken mid-packing. Some villagers attempted to intervene. In 1899, a group of fathers from Ashford Hollow marched to the mansion's gates, demanding answers for their missing sons. Jonathan Whitfield received them in his library, serving brandy and assuring them of his sorrow. He showed them ledgers, receipts, and signed notes of dismissal from the men themselves. The fathers left unsettled but quieted, unwilling to challenge the documents placed before them. Later, one confided that the handwriting on his son's note bore uncanny resemblance to Jonathan's own. Newspapers began to print small notices of missing persons, but the mansion's influence weighed heavily. Ashford Hollow relied on Whitfield donations for its chapel, its schoolhouse, its winter charity drives. Few editors dared imply wrongdoing. Instead, vanishings were attributed to the transience of rural life, men running from debts, young women seduced and lured away, workers seeking opportunity elsewhere. It was easier to believe in wanderlust than to accuse one of the region's most powerful families. But among villagers, the whisper hardened into certainty. The mansion devoured those who entered. By the first years of the new century, it was said openly in hushed tones that if a son took service with the Whitfields, he would not return. That if a traveler accepted their hospitality, he was lost. Children dared each other to climb the outer walls and flee before sunset, swearing they heard cries carried on the wind. Mothers forbade their daughters from going near the gates, while fathers prayed their sons would not be tempted by the promise of higher wages. Still, the Whitfields thrived. Their parties glittered, their names adorned plaques in town, and their carriages rolled proudly through the streets. Outwardly, nothing was amiss. But in the silence of missing letters, in the families who never found closure, in the names crossed out without funerals, the mystery was already weaving itself into the dark fabric of Ashford Hollow. And it was only the beginning. What little is known of the inner workings of the Whitfield mansion comes from the rare few who survived employment long enough to speak of it. Their testimonies, gathered in fragments over years, sketch a portrait of a household where silence was enforced and corridors concealed more than they revealed. Each story corroborated another. The rules of service were unlike those of any other estate. Servants were forbidden to ask questions, forbidden to stray from their assigned routes, and most chilling of all, forbidden to open doors that were said to already be occupied. A chambermaid named Margaret Cole recounted her brief tenure within the mansion before vanishing herself in the summer of 1898. She told her sister that she was assigned to dust and polish the same set of drawing rooms day after day, though they were never used. Meals were carried on trays and left outside the doors of the east wing. When she once knocked to announce the food, she swore she heard faint breathing from the other side. Hours later, she returned to collect the tray and found the dishes untouched, yet the silver cover lids had been carefully replaced. Margaret resigned in haste, but only weeks after she returned to her family home, she disappeared from her bed in the night. Another servant, a scullery boy named Edwin Tate, spoke in hushed tones at the village tavern after leaving his post. He described being ordered to scrub linens, marked with small, dark stains, too many for the household of 4 Whitfields. When he asked about the extra bedding, he was beaten by the steward and warned never to question again. He also spoke of the mansion's silence. Though grand gatherings were known to occur, Edwin said the majority of nights were unnervingly quiet. No footsteps, no voices, only the faint creak of wood and the echo of locks sliding shut. He recalled once being sent to the 3rd floor with a lantern. As he passed a long corridor, he saw that every door had been bolted from the outside. From within, a muffled sound rose like someone shifting in bed or whispering to themselves. Terrified, Edwin fled. His story was dismissed as drunken fantasy, yet weeks later he vanished while on an errand road that skirted the mansion grounds. There were also reports of rules that bordered on the absurd. New hires were instructed never to gaze too long at the family portraits in the main gallery, never to question why certain windows were boarded from the inside, and never to linger near the cellar stair. A laundress claimed that each week she washed garments belonging to individuals she had never seen. When she asked the housekeeper how many lived in the home, she was told curtly, "Only those you are meant to see." The architecture itself seemed to encourage secrecy. The mansion was riddled with wings that twisted away from the main hallways, staircases that ended at locked doors, and galleries that disappeared into darkness. A carpenter hired briefly to make repairs noted that entire sections of the mansion appeared uninhabited, yet meticulously maintained. He was paid generously, but ordered to never speak of what he saw. Soon after, he left Ashford Hollow altogether, abandoning his workshop. His neighbors said he was a changed man, pale and quick to silence whenever the Whitfield name was mentioned. Accounts also described the East Wing, which became a focal point of speculation. Several maids recalled being ordered to carry linens and meals to its heavy oak doors. The wing was always described as locked, yet small drafts of air leaked through the cracks, carrying with them a faint odor, sometimes medicinal, sometimes sweet, like herbs burned in ritual. One maid admitted that she once bent to peer through a keyhole. She claimed she saw rows of small cribs, each draped with white cloth, though no children were ever presented at church or town gatherings. She left her employment the very next day. Even the grand halls that dazzled visiting guests were not immune from suspicion. Servants whispered that while soirees filled the ballroom with laughter, other parts of the mansion remained alive with unseen movement. Dishes clattered in distant kitchens, though no staff had been sent there. Doors opened just enough for a sliver of candlelight to shine, then closed again without a sound. Some said the house itself seemed to breathe, as though the walls held inhabitants who never stepped into daylight. Most unnerving of all were the accounts of voices. A butler who served less than a year before retiring in nervous collapse told his nephew that he would sometimes hear quiet conversation drifting through the walls. The words were muffled, as if spoken by many mouths at once. Yet when he investigated the rooms, they were always empty. On one occasion, he entered the dining hall in the dead of night to find all the chairs drawn out, as if for a meal. Candles were burned down to stubs, though no gathering had taken place that evening. He left the mansion the very next morning, never to return. Taken together, these fragments paint a portrait of a household that functioned on two levels: the outward glamour of wealth and a hidden life of locked corridors, unseen occupants, and silence that was heavier than any sound. For every servant who left with trembling lips, another disappeared altogether, their warnings silenced by absence. It was as though the mansion consumed not only their labor, but their very presence in the world. And so, the legend deepened. Within the Whitfield mansion, rooms were occupied by shadows, doors locked not for protection, but concealment, and those who served within found themselves trapped in a house where secrets lived longer than people ever did. If the whispers of servants hinted at something hidden within the Whitfield mansion, the written record added another layer of unease. Parish registers, civic ledgers, and household accounts, meant to keep order in the life of Ashford Hollow, revealed patterns that could not be explained away. In the faded ink of old books and receipts, one could trace the shadows of lives that had no visible end, wages paid to those already vanished, and provisions delivered for far more mouths than anyone had ever seen at the table. The first to notice were the parish clerks, meticulous men whose duty was to maintain the rolls of births, marriages, and deaths. Names of Whitfield servants appeared with regularity: Clara Benton, Thomas, and Henry Miller, and a host of others. Yet for many, their records simply stopped. There were no burial entries, no notes of removal to other parishes, no marriages filed. Their wages, however, continued. The Whitfields, ever generous on paper, made quarterly donations to the church earmarked as wages for the upkeep of faithful staff. Priests thanked them publicly, but in the margins of some ledgers, faint notes can still be read: no sight of Clara in months, family inquiring, These annotations, written in cramped hands, speak of unease that the official record would not dare declare. Civil tax records deepen the strangeness. The estate claimed deductions for upwards of 24 household employees, at a time when villagers swore only half that number were ever glimpsed. Delivery accounts show that butchers sent entire carcasses of cattle, bakers delivered daily loaves by the dozen, and wine merchants rolled barrels through the gates. For a family of 4, even with staff, the quantities were excessive. A surviving bill from a local grocer lists 30 pounds of flour, 15 chickens, 6 pounds of butter, purchased in a single week. When asked about the size of the household, Jonathan Whitfield himself was said to have smiled and replied only, "We are a house of many needs." There were also ghost employees. Parish notations mention men and women by name who were never seen in town but appeared year after year in the Whitfield financial books. One such name, Agnes Dawes, received wages for nearly a decade, yet not a single villager could recall her face. No census listed her. When questioned, the Whitfield steward insisted she preferred her privacy. Others bore similar patterns, servants who lived nowhere, shopped nowhere, worshipped nowhere, but drew steady pay. Even the tradesmen grew suspicious. The baker's apprentice, years later, recalled that he delivered 20 loaves each morning to the kitchen door, yet he noted that only a fraction were ever collected by staff. The rest, he claimed, vanished by nightfall, though he never saw them carried away. The butcher reported similar accounts, cuts of meat ordered in quantities impossible for the visible household. When asked, the Whitfield cook, a stern woman named Hester Vale, told him simply, "You needn't worry who eats, only that it is paid for." Food deliveries were not the only oddity. Tailors and seamstresses were contracted for garments in sizes that puzzled them. Orders for dresses too small for Eleanor Whitfield, shirts far broader than Jonathan's build, and children's clothing stitched in costly fabric were paid promptly, but never seen in church pews or village lanes. One tailor later confided that he sewed entire wardrobes for ghosts, never once meeting the supposed wearers. And then there were the coal deliveries. Records preserved in town archives reveal that the mansion consumed fuel at a rate far exceeding even its cavernous size. Wagon after wagon rolled into the estate, especially in the dead of winter. Yet villagers noted the mansion's chimneys produced no more smoke than a modest farmhouse. Where did all that coal go? Some speculated it fueled hidden furnaces in the cellars, others that it warmed rooms never opened to daylight. The most chilling documents came from the parish accounts of burial fees. In Ashford Hollow, every death carried a small payment for the ringing of bells and upkeep of graves. Yet throughout the height of the Whitfield estate's influence, these fees dwindled. Fewer graves were dug, though more names disappeared. It was as if lives were being erased without the courtesy of burial. The ledger leaves behind a silence as damning as any testimony. Taken alone, each inconsistency might be dismissed as error or eccentricity. Taken together, they form a web of contradictions too dense to ignore. Wages paid to those unseen, food ordered for mouths that were never counted, coal consumed in vast amounts without smoke to show for it, tailors sewing for children who never appeared. The paper trail became its own ghost story, a chorus of absences written into the very fabric of the town's history. For those who dared to look too closely, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Whitfield mansion housed more than it revealed. The ledgers, intended to measure life and death, instead testified to lives unaccounted for, sustained in secrecy behind locked doors. And in every unpaid burial fee, in every meal prepared for an unseen diner, the warning grew clearer. The Whitfield household was not merely eccentric, it was a house of hidden occupants, sustained by silence and shielded by wealth. As the vanishings mounted and whispers hardened into conviction, the Whitfield mansion inevitably drew the attention of those tasked with keeping order or those hungry for a story. Local sheriffs, journalists from neighboring counties, even curious lawyers seeking to make names for themselves, all found their way to the great iron gates. And yet, time and again, their efforts dissolved into silence. Some were bought, some turned away in sudden fear, and some simply disappeared into the house, their names vanishing from official record as if they had never existed. The first attempt at inquiry came in the winter of 1899, when Sheriff Alden Briggs of Ashford Hollow received a petition signed by several families demanding he investigate the disappearances of their sons and daughters. Briggs, a stout man with a reputation for fairness, rode to the mansion with a deputy at his side. Villagers watched as the two men passed through the gates. By dusk, only Briggs returned, his face pale, his voice curt. To questions about what he had found, he offered only, "Nothing to warrant alarm." His deputy was never seen again. When pressed, Briggs insisted the man had taken ill and left the county. Yet his name vanished from the sheriff's own payroll records within a month, erased as if he had never drawn breath. Newspapers, too, tested the gates. In 1902, the Hartford Chronicle dispatched a reporter named Samuel Pierce to investigate rumors of vanishing travelers. His editor later received a telegram from Pierce, "Arrived Ashford Hollow. Dining with Whitfields tonight. Will send report tomorrow." No further word came. The editor, alarmed, sent inquiries to the local post office. They confirmed that Pierce had indeed checked in at the town inn, but left his belongings behind. When the editor himself pressed officials for answers, he was advised to drop the matter. Weeks later, the Chronicle printed a brief notice that Pierce had left journalism for private business, though no evidence of such employment was ever found. Other journalists fared little better. Articles drafted about the mansion were often pulled before print, editors citing insufficient proof or threat of libel. In some cases, the typeset pages themselves disappeared from archive drawers. One young apprentice printer later claimed he saw Whitfield men enter the press office late at night, carrying sealed envelopes, and leave with the proofs of damning stories. His account was dismissed as youthful fancy, but no copies of those articles remain. The Whitfields were adept at softening inquiry. Sheriffs invited to dine returned with new horses or heavy purses. Judges who raised questions were soon seen enjoying the Whitfields' summer retreats. Ministers who hinted at moral rot found their churches refurbished at the family's expense. Influence radiated outward, wrapping the mansion in a shield of respectability that made open accusation all but impossible. Yet not all could be bought. In 1904, a state investigator named Daniel Crawford arrived under orders to review labor conditions across rural estates. He asked pointedly about wages paid to servants no one had seen, about food deliveries recorded in ledgers far exceeding household needs. Villagers watched as he entered the mansion one gray morning. They never saw him leave. Months later, the official report he was meant to file appeared in state archives, but curiously, it contained no mention of the Whitfields. His name was struck from payroll rolls soon after. To his family, authorities explained that he had resigned for health reasons. They received no body, no letter, no farewell. The suppression was systematic. Court dockets from Ashford Hollow show entire pages missing, where cases against the Whitfields should have appeared. Parish records note donations that coincide with the sudden withdrawal of formal complaints. It was as if the machinery of law and memory had been bent to preserve the family's facade. Even rumors that reached beyond county lines seemed to falter, choked off before gaining traction. Still, stories spread among the villagers, growing darker each year. A tavern keeper claimed that a journalist from Boston arrived, demanding directions to the estate. He was last seen walking toward the gates at dusk. The next morning, his satchel was found on the roadside, empty save for a notepad with only one sentence scrawled across the page. "The house does not let go." His name never appeared in any Boston obituary, nor in the town's burial ledgers. It was as if the world had conspired to erase him. By the time the first decade of the 20th century waned, the Whitfield mansion had become a place where inquiry itself seemed cursed. To question was to invite disappearance. To record was to invite erasure. Villagers learned to hold their tongues, officials learned to look the other way, and the archives themselves bore scars of removal. For every missing son or vanished traveler, there were papers missing, names crossed out, reports misfiled, until they might as well have never been written. The mansion's silence was not only physical but bureaucratic. It lived in vanished reports, in absent obituaries, in clerks' ledgers scrubbed clean. Investigators arrived at the gate with resolve and left in silence, or did not leave at all. And so, through bribery, fear, and disappearance, the Whitfields ensured their estate remained untouchable. The gates stood closed, the records falsified, and the question unspoken: how many lives, how many truths, had been swallowed whole by the house on the hill? While servants whispered of locked wings and investigators vanished into silence, the Whitfields themselves walked through the world, cloaked in virtue. To the eyes of Ashford Hollow and the counties beyond, they were models of piety and generosity, pillars of a society that prized public benevolence as much as private fortune. Newspapers praised their benefactions, church bells rang in their honor, and children learned their name not with fear, but with gratitude. The Whitfields gave abundantly to orphanages, hospitals, chapels, and schools. Every brick that bore their seal gleamed like a talisman against suspicion. Yet beneath the golden surface, rumors whispered that their philanthropy served not the needy, but themselves, masking the darker secrets of the mansion that towered above the town. Jonathan Whitfield understood the power of spectacle. On holy days, he strode through the parish doors, his family following in solemn procession. He was always first to kneel, first to place a heavy tithe in the collection plate. His wife, Eleanor, gifted hymnals bound in leather to the choir. Their children, schooled in Europe, brought back delicate artifacts that adorned the church altar. Parishioners saw only piety. Few dared recall that those same pews had been filled by mothers still grieving children lost to service in the Whitfield home. Yet grief was softened by donations, plaster repaired, stained glass replaced, coffers filled with quiet gold. The congregation, bound by need, found it easier to forgive what they could not confront. Beyond the church, the family's influence spread like ivy. They funded an orphanage 2 towns over, its dormitories built of stone, cut from the same quarry that raised their mansion. They donated to hospitals in Hartford, their names etched into marble plaques. They supplied coal to keep the poor warm in bitter winters. These acts were real, undeniable, and visible to all. Yet in taverns and kitchens, villagers whispered another story: that the orphanage, so generously supplied, often received children who were never seen again after arriving. That the hospital wing built with Whitfield gold held locked wards no visitor could enter. Some claimed the family's donations were not selfless gifts, but an exchange, a way to secure quiet partners who would ask no questions. Journalists, when they pressed too closely, were met with benevolent deflection. Jonathan would grant interviews in his study, shelves behind him stacked with Bibles and volumes of philosophy. He spoke in calm tones of his duty to God and community, of his belief that wealth was only a stewarded gift meant to ease the suffering of others. Editors, charmed by his gravity, often left with fat envelopes of contributions to their publications. Articles that began with probing questions concluded with flowery praise of the family's charity. To speak against the Whitfields was to risk looking ungrateful, even sacrilegious. The mask of benevolence extended into politics. Town elections were quietly funded by Whitfield gold, always ensuring the rise of sympathetic leaders. Sheriffs whose duty was to guard the law instead guarded the family's reputation. Judges sat at Whitfield tables, toasting their generosity with imported wine. It was said that a man could not rise in Ashford Hollow without passing through the shadow of the mansion gates. The family's money, and the fear of losing it, kept the town bound in loyal silence. Yet, in every gesture of generosity, a darker reflection lingered. When the Whitfields paid for the church's new bell, villagers remembered the tolling that had never been rung for their missing sons. When they donated food to the poor, people whispered that the mansion itself consumed far more than it ever gave away. And when they built an orphanage, mothers crossed themselves and prayed their children would never fall under its roof. Still, no one could deny the reach of their influence. If an accusation arose, it was drowned by a wave of charitable remembrance. Surely not them. people would say. They gave us bread, they healed our sick, they clothed our children. To condemn the Whitfields was to bite the hand that fed the entire county. And so, their public mask held firm, even as the air around the mansion thickened with rumor. But masks, no matter how finely crafted, cannot hide the weight of silence forever. Every hymn sung in Whitfield gifted pews, every child sheltered in a Whitfield orphanage, every stone of a hospital wing built with their name carried with it an uneasy echo, that beneath each act of charity lay something far more sinister. The Whitfields were not merely benefactors. They were benefactors who bought silence, purchased obedience, and clothed themselves in generosity to conceal the darkness festering in the locked corridors of their mansion. Thus, the paradox grew sharper. In the daylight, the family shone with virtue. At night, villagers whispered of the cries they swore drifted from the mansion windows. By coin and by hymn, the Whitfields secured their place as saints in public memory, while behind closed doors, their secrets remained untouched, shielded by the very good deeds that should have damned them. Though most who entered the Whitfield mansion never returned, a few managed to leave, slipping through the iron gates with trembling lips and memories that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Their accounts, scattered across parish notes, tavern whispers, and the cautious recollections of relatives, form one of the only windows into the shadowed life of the estate. They spoke of duties that defied reason, of empty rooms that demanded constant care, of meals prepared for diners who never appeared, and of cribs tended with the devotion of nurses though no children ever stirred within them. Each story is different in detail, yet together they echo with the same terrible refrain. The house demanded labor not for the living, but for something unseen. One such voice belonged to Sarah Morton, a laundress who lasted no more than 3 months in service. In the safety of her cousin's kitchen, she confessed that her tasks included scrubbing linens from rooms no one occupied. Every morning, she said, a fresh bundle would appear outside the locked doors of the East Wing. Sheets, nightclothes, sometimes children's garments, though no child lived in that house. They were marked with stains. I could not place shadows of use without the sight of the user. She described how the housekeeper instructed her never to knock, never to question, only to collect, wash, and return them. Sarah left abruptly one night, refusing to fetch another bundle. Days later, she fled the county entirely, her relatives whispering that she had seen something in those cloths that would not let her sleep. Another testimony came from Michael Drury, a kitchen boy, scarcely 16. He confessed at the tavern that he was often sent to prepare trays of food, enough for dozens of mouths. Yet the household table seated only 4. We cooked chicken after chicken, bread after bread, he said. But when I brought the trays upstairs, the doors stayed shut. I left them in the hall, and when I came back, the trays were empty. Not eaten as a man eats, not with bones scattered or crumbs spilled, but cleared as if nothing had ever been there. His words drew uneasy laughter at first, until he swore he once pressed his ear against one of the doors and heard not chewing, but a chorus of faint sighs, like people breathing in unison. Terrified, he left the mansion under pretense of illness and never returned. He disappeared years later on a road leading back toward Ashford Hollow. Perhaps the most disturbing account came from a maid named Elise Turner. She served in the nursery, though no nursery was ever spoken of outside the mansion walls. Elise told her sister that she was ordered to polish cribs, wash tiny sheets, and rock empty cradles. The housekeeper insisted the infants were kept elsewhere, yet meals of warm milk were placed on the windowsills, vanishing by morning without a trace. Sometimes, Elise whispered, I would hear crying in the night, not from one child, but from many. Yet when I entered the room, the cribs were still, the air cold, and the crying stopped as if it had never been. Elise quit after only weeks, her nerves broken, and was said to wake screaming for years afterward. Other servants spoke of unseen presences that walked the halls. A butler recalled candles extinguishing as he passed, followed by footsteps that matched his pace but never revealed themselves. A chambermaid swore that when she dusted the parlor, she found chairs drawn back and indentations on cushions as if someone had just risen. She would straighten them, only to return moments later and find them disturbed again. When she reported this to the steward, he looked at her sternly and replied, "Best to think the house entertains more than the eye can see." The most chilling testimony was given by a gardener who worked the grounds. He claimed that at dusk, while trimming the hedges beneath the nursery windows, he saw pale figures watching him from behind the glass. "Children," he said, "but not the Whitfield children. Dozens of them, all pressed to the panes, silent as stones." When he looked again, the windows were empty, the curtains swaying, though no wind had stirred. He left his tools in the grass and walked away, never to collect his pay. What united these testimonies was the sense of duties performed for occupants who did not exist in daylight, beds made for sleepers no one saw, food prepared for diners never seated, cribs rocked for infants never presented. Each witness recalled not merely the strangeness of their tasks, but the atmosphere of the mansion itself, the feeling that eyes lingered in every corridor, that doors concealed more than rooms, that the air itself carried the weight of lives unacknowledged. Rare as they are, these voices remain some of the most direct evidence against the illusion the Whitfields maintain. Though their words were often dismissed as fancy, and though many of them vanished not long after, their recollections pierce the silence left by erased reports and vanished records. In their fragments, one glimpses the mansion as it truly was, a place where labor served the unseen, where presence and absence blurred, and where those who fled carried with them memories too heavy to bear. And if their stories are to be believed, the Whitfield mansion was never truly empty. It was filled with occupants whose existence was forbidden to be acknowledged, yet whose hunger and sorrow echoed in every locked room. The grandeur of the Whitfield mansion was not merely a matter of taste, but of design, an edifice built as much for concealment as for display. While guests marveled at its marble columns and glittering chandeliers, those who served within, or dared venture deeper, discovered an architecture bent toward control. The house was less a residence than a labyrinth, a structure where secrecy was set in stone, where walls whispered and doors seemed designed not to invite passage but to forbid it. From the outside, the mansion loomed with symmetry, a central hall flanked by wings, windows tall and evenly spaced, and a roof crowned with gables. Yet once within, visitors quickly lost their sense of orientation. Corridors bent unexpectedly, staircases ended at blank walls, and certain rooms repeated in bewildering succession, as though the house itself conspired to confuse memory. Servants spoke of secret staircases concealed behind paneling, narrow spirals that climbed between floors unseen. One carpenter recalled being hired to repair such a stair. He noted the steps bore no dust, no wear, as though they were swept clean by passage no one admitted to making. The deeper one ventured, the stranger the architecture became. Beneath the grand ballroom stretched a series of cellars that seemed to expand with each inspection. At first glance, they served practical purposes: wine racks, coal stores, root cellars. Yet beyond the familiar rooms lay sealed vaults, arched stone chambers, accessible only by heavy iron doors. The locks were mounted on the inside, an arrangement that defied logic. Who, villagers wondered, would choose to lock themselves in? A stonemason once summoned to reinforce a vault wall later told a confidant that as he worked, he felt faint vibrations in the stone, as though someone pressed against it from within. He finished quickly, left without his full pay, and never returned. The mansion's very walls seemed alive with sound. Servants described muffled voices drifting through plaster, footsteps reverberating along passages long abandoned. A butler claimed that when he leaned against the wainscoting of the East Hall, he could hear what sounded like dozens of people murmuring, though the corridor had been sealed for years. Even bricks bore strange qualities, some cool as ice to the touch, others faintly warm, as though concealing hidden flues or unseen fires. More disturbing still were the rooms that bore locks on the inside. Several maids confessed to carrying trays into chambers where the handles were bolted from within, doors opening only a crack before hands reached out to drag the food inside. No one saw the diners. No one asked. When the maids returned later, the trays were emptied, yet the bolts had been drawn again. The implication was unavoidable. The mansion housed occupants who lived not in freedom, but in confinement. The architecture above ground carried its own sinister flourishes. Windows were boarded from the inside, their curtains drawn so tightly that even sunlight seemed barred from entry. Hallways narrowed into choking passages where sound carried unnaturally, amplifying every creak of a floorboard until it seemed another followed close behind. Servants claimed mirrors lined certain rooms, not for vanity, but to reflect angles of corridors otherwise hidden, allowing unseen eyes to watch. Perhaps most chilling were the subterranean chambers, said to stretch far beneath the foundations. Several accounts speak of tunnels running from the mansion into the woods, lined with damp stone and arched ceilings blackened by soot. These were not simple storm drains. They were wide enough for carriages, braced with iron beams, and marked by symbols carved into the stone symbols no villager recognized. Some whispered that the tunnels were escape routes. Others insisted they were prisons, or worse, sanctuaries for rituals no daylight could witness. One servant, trembling in recollection, described being led into such a chamber after stumbling upon a locked wing. She spoke of rows of narrow cells, each with doors barred from the outside, and within them faint traces of occupation, scraps of fabric, claw marks on wood, and walls scrawled with prayers. She claimed she fled at the first chance, never daring to look behind her. Within a month, she had vanished, her tale preserved only in the memory of the friend who recorded it. Even the mansion's grandest features masked darker purposes. The library, praised by visiting scholars for its collection, contained a spiral stair hidden behind the shelves. Those who descended found themselves not in another reading room, but in a chamber lined with stone basins and iron chains. Above, the ballroom's vaulted ceiling carried peculiar acoustics. Whispers in one corner could be heard clear as day in another, while music seemed to swell unnaturally loud, as if carried by unseen amplifiers within the walls. Whether by accident or design, the architecture itself seemed meant to disorient, to magnify the presence of the unseen, to remind every inhabitant that the mansion belonged less to its owners than to the secrets it contained. To those who entered, the mansion was never a home. It was a fortress of silence, a place where architecture became an instrument of power. Each hidden stair, each sealed vault, each chamber with locks turned inward, whispered the same truth. The Whitfields had built their house not merely to shelter themselves, but to command and contain whatever dwelled within. And though its marble facade gleamed in sunlight, its foundations lay heavy in shadow, echoing with voices no one dared claim as their own. If the ledgers and testimonies painted the Whitfield mansion as a house of hidden lives, the rumors that began to circulate in the first years of the new century gave it a darker edge. For beyond the locked rooms and unseen diners, villagers whispered of midnight gatherings, candlelit halls, and rites that blurred the line between religion and blasphemy. The Whitfields, long admired for their donations to churches and orphanages, were now spoken of in the same breath as occultists and secret orders. The mansion's silence by day was replaced in rumor by strange sounds at night, muffled chanting, rhythmic footsteps, and the acrid tang of burning herbs carried on the wind. Witnesses swore they saw figures moving through the halls after midnight. A farmer tending to his livestock claimed that, while cutting across the meadow by the mansion, he glimpsed robed silhouettes in the windows, their forms swaying in unison around what appeared to be a great circle of candles. Another villager, walking home after a late tavern shift, described hearing low, sonorous voices rising and falling in patterns too measured to be casual conversation. He said the sound made his chest vibrate, as though the earth itself were echoing with their rhythm. Even more disturbing were the accounts of smell. Several villagers reported catching the scent of smoke on still nights, not the familiar odor of coal or hearth fire, but something sweeter, cloying, laced with bitterness like herbs smoldering in hidden braziers. Dogs, they said, whined and cowered when the air thickened with it. Those who dared follow the smoke claimed it always drifted from the eastern wing, the part of the house most fiercely guarded from intrusion. Religious leaders found themselves caught in uneasy positions. The town minister, Reverend Harlan, spoke once in a sermon of unnatural gatherings and the sin of secret devotion. His words, though veiled, were understood by the congregation as aimed at the Whitfields. Within a week, the chapel roof was repaired and its debts settled by the family's donation. The Reverend never again spoke against them. Instead, he praised their generosity from the pulpit, urging the congregation to see in them the light of Christian charity. Others were less forgiving. A traveling preacher, fiery in tone, accused the Whitfields directly during a revival meeting. He warned that their wealth had been purchased by unholy covenants, and that their mansion stood as a temple to darkness. Weeks later, his tent burned in the night, and he fled the county, never to return. Villagers muttered that the Whitfields' reach extended beyond the pews, into the very safety of those who dared condemn them. Still, the whispers multiplied. Some claimed to have seen carriages arriving after midnight, their passengers cloaked and veiled, slipping through the gates without sound. These visitors were never recognized in town, nor did they stay at local inns. Their presence was marked only by the sudden glow of candlelight in the mansion's upper windows and the faint strains of music that drifted down the hillside. Not the joyous music of the Whitfield summer balls, but something slower, almost mournful, carried on strings and deep brass. The architecture of the mansion seemed to lend weight to these suspicions. Its vaulted halls and echoing chambers could easily accommodate gatherings hidden from the outside world. Servants who fled spoke of long tables laid with bowls of ash, of cloaks stored in closets though no master ever wore them in daylight, of candle wax pooled thick on the ballroom floor, as though night after night of ceremonies had melted the light into the very stone. One maid swore she saw Eleanor Whitfield herself, normally the paragon of poise, dressed in a hooded garment, her face shadowed, her hands raised above a circle drawn in chalk. Whispers of ritual soon entwined with the vanishings. Mothers whose children had disappeared after taking service at the mansion murmured that their sons and daughters had been offered as part of the ceremonies. Though no proof was ever given, the rumor was enough to harden suspicion. Others said the Whitfields called upon spirits for guidance, summoning voices from beyond to guard their wealth and silence their enemies. A few even claimed the family had bargained with something not human, binding their fortune to a force that fed upon the lives concealed behind their gates. The tension reached its height when a group of townsfolk, emboldened by drink, marched toward the mansion one autumn night, intent on exposing the supposed ritual. They stopped at the gates, for from within came the sound of chanting low, rhythmic, and accompanied by the thrum of drums. Fear overcame their bravado, and they fled back to the tavern, swearing never to approach again. The story spread quickly, and though mocked by some, many avoided the mansion thereafter. In this way, the Whitfields' public mask and private whispers coexisted, feeding one another. By day, they donated to churches, their names engraved in marble. By night, the town spoke of cloaks, chanting, and fires that burned without ash. The contradiction kept suspicion at bay. How could benefactors also be blasphemers? Yet the very unease ensured the family remained unchallenged. Religious leaders alternated between rebuke and praise. Townsfolk oscillated between gratitude and dread, and the mansion stood secure behind its gates. Over time, the rituals became more legend than fact, yet the memory of them clung to the estate. Children dared each other to shout prayers at its walls, believing the house itself might answer. Old women crossed themselves when its lights flared at midnight, and in the silence that followed, the air of Ashford Hollow seemed always heavy with the echo of voices, an echo that suggested the Whitfields' gatherings had never truly ended, but continued in shadows, their chants woven into the very stones of the house that concealed them. If servants and travelers formed the earliest pattern of disappearances at the Whitfield mansion, the most troubling came later, when the vanished were no longer the poor or the nameless, but prominent men and women of standing. Over the course of decades, visitors of means, lawyers, landowners, merchants, accepted the Whitfields' invitations to dine, only to vanish from public life. Their absences were quietly explained away in newspapers or legal notices, yet the outcomes always seemed to share the same refrain. Their property, their fortunes, their influence somehow found its way into Whitfield hands. The first such case that stirred real unease was that of Silas Greer, a prosperous mill owner from Hartford. In the spring of 1901, he was known to have traveled to Ashford Hollow at Jonathan Whitfield's request to discuss a potential investment in textiles. Greer sent a letter to his wife the morning of his departure. "Dining with Whitfields tonight. Will return in 2 days." He was never seen again. His estate, after a lengthy and curious probate process, was eventually purchased by a Whitfield-controlled trust at a fraction of its value. The Hartford papers recorded his disappearance in 2 lines. "Mr. Greer has taken leave for extended travels abroad. No ticket was ever found, no letters ever sent." The pattern continued. In 1903, Dr. Nathaniel Hollis, a physician of reputation in Boston, traveled to the mansion to consult on Eleanor Whitfield's nervous complaints. Hollis's carriage was witnessed entering the gates, but not departing. Within months, the Whitfield family announced a new charitable hospital wing in Hartford, furnished in part by Hollis's former estate. His colleagues were told he had retired to Europe, though none ever received correspondence from him again. The most brazen case came later that decade, involving Colonel James Abernathy, a Civil War veteran and land baron. Abernathy had long resisted selling his property, which bordered Whitfield land. In the autumn of 1906, he accepted an invitation to negotiate terms over supper at the mansion. He entered the house at dusk. By dawn, his land deeds were signed over, his signature curiously neat for a man known to tremble with age. The colonel himself was never seen again. His absence was explained by a single announcement posted weeks later in the Town Gazette. "Colonel Abernathy has departed to reside with kin in Virginia." No kin in Virginia ever existed. Rumors spread that the mansion had become a kind of spider's web, drawing men of influence into its parlor only to strip them of wealth and voice. Some spoke of after-dinner walks through the eastern wing, from which guests did not return. Others claimed that at certain dinners, the Whitfields insisted on offering their guests special wine, poured from dark bottles not shown to others. Once drunk, the guests' laughter grew sluggish, their voices faded, and by morning their absence was explained away as though foreordained. Legal documents fed suspicion. Time and again, the estates of vanished visitors passed not to heirs, but into the hands of Whitfield-owned trusts or friendly intermediaries. Deeds, wills, and signatures appeared in archives, always tidy, always uncontested, though those who studied them whispered that the handwriting sometimes bore uncanny similarity to Jonathan Whitfield's own script. Lawyers who raised questions found themselves silenced by sudden promotions or disappeared themselves into the long corridor of the mansion's influence. The townsfolk noticed the pattern most clearly in the sudden swelling of the Whitfield estate itself. Lands once belonging to others now extended the mansion's grounds. Businesses once independent now flew the Whitfield crest. Yet when murmurs grew too loud, the family unveiled another act of philanthropy: a chapel donation, a hospital ward, or a winter gift of coal to the poor. Gratitude smothered suspicion, but only outwardly. In private, villagers warned each other never to accept an invitation, no matter how gilded the envelope. Still, some could not resist the allure. The Whitfields' reputation for opulence drew ambitious men eager to curry favor. Their dining table glittered with imported glass. Their wines flowed from French cellars, their music played by hired quartets. To be seen in their company was to elevate one's own status. And so, despite the whispers, guests continued to arrive. The road leading to the mansion became a path of no return, its stones trodden by men who believed they were stepping into fortune, only to vanish into silence. As the years wore on, the mansion's reputation shifted from eccentric to predatory. Where once people muttered about odd servants or strange lights, now they whispered of estates stripped bare, fortunes consumed, and families left with nothing but rumors, yet none dared challenge openly. The Whitfields' mask of charity held firm, their influence bought silence, and their gates remained closed to scrutiny. Thus, the legend of the vanishing guests took its place among the darker chapters of Ashford Hollow's memory. They were not drifters or nameless servants, but men and women of standing, drawn into the mansion by invitation and erased without trace. Their wealth paved the Whitfields' path to power, their silence filled the locked rooms, and their absence became yet another warning. To dine with the Whitfields was to risk never walking out alive. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Whitfield mansion's shadow loomed too heavily to be ignored. The disappearances of servants, travelers, and even prominent guests had piled into a record too vast for whispers alone to contain. Families pressed petitions, clergy murmured concern, and journalists hinted at scandal. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the weight of accusation might breach the gates at last. A trial was whispered of in Ashford Hollow, a reckoning for the Whitfield mansion mystery, why no one ever left alive. Yet no such reckoning came. What followed instead was a theater of delay, erasure, and protection so thorough that justice itself was swallowed whole. The first attempt at legal action came in 1909, when the relatives of Colonel James Abernathy formally accused the Whitfields of foul play in his disappearance. They presented letters, witnesses who had seen him enter the mansion gates, and protested the sudden transfer of his lands. A hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse, yet on the morning of testimony, the letters vanished from the clerk's files. The witnesses who had spoken so confidently days before recanted, their voices trembling. One declared he had been mistaken about the date. Another swore it was too dark to be certain. Within weeks, the case was dismissed for insufficient proof. It was not the only collapse. In 1911, a Boston lawyer named Henry Carraway pressed charges on behalf of the widow of Dr. Nathaniel Hollis. He traveled with a dossier of evidence letters, receipts, and notes from Hollis's colleagues. But when the trial was set to begin, Carraway himself vanished. He was last seen boarding a carriage bound for Ashford Hollow. His body was never found, and his dossier evaporated from public record. Without his presence, the court declared the case unprosecutable. Judges, too, seemed to bend beneath unseen pressure. Magistrate Eli Whitcomb, initially assigned to the Abernathy case, recused himself without explanation, though he had served 20 years on the bench without hesitation in other scandals. Rumor claimed that his family received a sudden endowment from a Whitfield-controlled trust to fund his daughter's marriage. Another judge, rumored to be firm in his intention to press the matter, was abruptly reassigned to Hartford, leaving the case to languish in limbo. Even when juries were impaneled, proceedings faltered. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was misfiled, and clerks reported break-ins at night that targeted only court storage rooms. One sheriff, emboldened enough to speak, claimed he had locked away affidavits sworn by 3 servants who had fled the mansion. When he returned days later, the box was empty, the lock unbroken. He resigned within the month. Behind these failures stood a fortress of influence. The Whitfields had long cultivated political allies through donations and discreet favors. Local officials dined at their tables, ministers praised their piety, and newspapers received generous patronage. Whenever a case began to gain momentum, the family's beneficence redoubled. A new chapel bell was funded, a hospital wing dedicated, a poorhouse stocked with coal. Gratitude turned into silence. No one wished to condemn the hands that built their institutions, no matter how dark the rumors behind them. Clerical voices alternated between condemnation and absolution. A few brave preachers declared from their pulpits that the Whitfields were a house of sin, but their churches soon suffered mysterious fires, debts, or loss of patronage. Most clergy, confronted with the choice between poverty and silence, chose silence, cloaking it in language of forgiveness. Parish bulletins praised the Whitfields for charitable works beyond measure, even as parishioners buried their suspicions beneath bowed heads. Newspapers, once eager to investigate, shifted their tone. Editorials became florid praise. Society pages filled with descriptions of Whitfield balls, and mention of disappearances grew scarce. Archives from the period show curious gaps, with entire issues missing or replaced with blank reels. It was as though the memory of accusation itself had been systematically erased. And so, the trial that might have exposed the Whitfields never arrived. What began as petitions hardened into silence. What evidence once existed was shredded or burned. What voices rose in protest fell quiet, bought or broken. Justice was smothered not by a single act, but by the slow weight of wealth pressing upon every channel of accountability. In the end, the mansion's gates never opened to a court summons. No Whitfield ever stood before a judge. No jury ever heard testimony. No verdict was ever given. Instead, the family continued untouched, their public mask intact, their reputation polished by the very institutions meant to condemn them. They remained in public esteem, saints of charity by day, shadows of rumor by night. The story of the trial that never was became a tale in itself, another ghost in the mansion's history. It whispered a lesson more chilling than any locked corridor, that power, when fortified by wealth and piety, could silence even the law. And so the Whitfields endured, their mansion gleaming on the hill, untouchable, their secrets locked tighter than any cellars beneath their house. When the Whitfield line began to fade and the mansion itself slipped into decline, the silence surrounding it did not vanish, it transformed. With the iron gates rusting and the windows shattered by storms, the estate became less a fortress of influence than a ruin of fear. Yet in that ruin, stories multiplied. What had once been whispered, suspicions became open legends. The folklore of Ashford Hollow, tales told by firelight to children who shivered, even as they begged for more. If the Whitfield mansion had devoured lives in secret during its years of grandeur, it now consumed the imagination of those who lived in its shadow. Locals spoke first of lights. Long after the house was abandoned, villagers swore they saw candles burning in the upper windows, flickering against the cracked panes. Farmers working their fields at dusk claimed the lights moved in patterns, shifting from room to room as though carried by unseen hands. Some said entire corridors blazed with illumination before winking out all at once. Others swore that lanterns drifted along the balcony, circling endlessly, never revealing who bore them. The mansion was dark by day, but by night it pulsed with a phantom life. Then came the sounds. Travelers passing along the road at midnight reported hearing the cries of children carried on the wind-thin wails, like infants seeking comfort. Yet, when searchers entered the ruin, they found nothing but broken cribs, their frames gnawed with rot, their linens long since reduced to dust. Some described hearing footsteps in the halls, a patter too light to be adult, too erratic to be explained by settling boards. These echoes, paired with the stories of vanished servants and ghostly nurseries, gave rise to a belief that the souls of lost children remained trapped inside, calling out in endless sorrow. Whispers, too, became part of the folklore. Visitors who dared step across the threshold often claimed that if they paused in silence, they could hear voices weaving through the air. Not shouts or conversation, but murmurs, soft as prayer, overlapping until no words could be distinguished. Some said the voices spoke directly to them, repeating their names, urging them deeper into the house. Others described a humming chorus that seemed to rise from the walls themselves, as though the mansion had become a vast throat, still speaking for the family that built it. The architecture, once merely strange, took on a supernatural aura in memory. Children dared each other to enter, whispering of doors that closed behind them and would not open again. One-way doors, they called them thresholds, that swallowed the curious whole. A popular tale told of a group of boys who slipped inside during a storm. Only two emerged, pale and trembling, claiming the third had passed through a narrow door in the east wing that shut with a clang of iron. They beat on it, screamed his name, but the door remained sealed. When villagers later pried it open, they found only dust and a room that had no other exit. The missing boy was never found. Folklore also lingered around the mansion's subterranean chambers. Hunters swore that hollow echoes drifted from vents in the hillside, as if chants still resonated beneath the earth. One tale told of a man who followed the sound of drums into the cellars, only to emerge 3 days later with no memory of what had transpired. He lived, but he never spoke again, save to mutter the same phrase when pressed: "The house does not let go." Even the gates carried legend. It was said that those who grasped the bars at midnight would feel them pulse like veins, as though blood still flowed through the iron. Some swore that if you looked too long at the rust, it shimmered wetly, like fresh stains that refused to dry. To this day, old families in Ashford Hollow warn their children never to linger near those gates, not for fear of trespassing, but because the gates remember. As years passed, the mansion shifted from dread to symbol. For some, it became a story of arrogance, how wealth and secrecy consumed a family and cursed their legacy. For others, it was a haunted place, proof that spirits lingered where injustice reigned. In every version, one truth remained. The Whitfield mansion was a place where absence was louder than presence, where those who entered risked being erased, not only from the world, but from memory itself. Thus, folklore preserved what courts and records erased. The tales of lights in the windows, of children crying in the dark, of whispers that followed trespassers home. These became the true legacy of the Whitfields. No plaques of charity, no marble donations in chapels, could outshine the stories that took root in the town's memory. The house became a living warning, a reminder passed down through generations. Grandeur can mask horror, and some doors, once entered, may never open again.